Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program Discuss, your platform for in depth analysis on issues shaping Nigerians' future. I am Samuel Odi. Many thanks for joining. Today, we focus on major issues touching every Nigerian home and business, which is inflation, from food markets to fuel stations, from airport fares to school fees. The rising cost of living continues to stretch household income and increase economic pressure across the country. Questions are now being asked: why is inflation rapidly or rising rapidly and what role do fuel subsidy removal and exchange rate instability play in the recent rising cost of living that we're witnessing in Nigeria? And questions are still being asked: can Nigerian policies reverse this trend? And most importantly, how are ordinary Nigerians coping? This is what we'll be finding out on today's edition of Discuss, as we set to examine the inflation crisis and its key drivers. Looking at all of this concerns, inflation trend is rising, and again rising prices of food items, rice, cooking gas, transportation, electricity, exchange rate, and so on and so forth. The fluctuation is something that is actually affecting the way people run business, the way individuals also tend to run their homes in Nigeria, which is something of a very big concern. Inflation refers to a sustained increase in the price of goods and services over time in Nigeria. Food inflation remains one of the most biggest concern, as families spend more on basic necessities. Economic analysts point to several factors behind the current inflationary measures: fuel subsidy removal, foreign exchange volatility, insecurity affecting food production, high transportation costs, and also global economic uncertainty. So you all know what's happening in the global economy, in the global space between the US, Israel, and Iran. We saw the impact that the war, or Russia's war on Ukraine, we saw the impact it had on the global market in terms of food circulation and all. And now the war also going on between Israel, US, and Iran also is also contributing negatively to the global economy, and also is trickling down to developing economies like that of Nigeria and Africa, and some part of Europe are being hit the most. Even some Asian parts of the world is also being hit with all of these trends and concerns, this unrest going on in the Middle East. But we'll get to see how Nigeria can be able to keep head above water, despite the fact that we saw the rebasing of the economy about a year ago. We saw the rebasing of the economy, and despite that, now we are still seeing that the inflation is rising based on what the National Bureau of Statistics released on the 15th of this month. We saw that Nigeria's inflation, went a bit higher from 15.33% to almost 16%. So we are going to be looking at the key drivers that are facilitating and that is behind this surge that we are seeing. In major markets across Nigeria, traders and consumers say price change almost weekly. The cost of rice, tomatoes, oil, bread, and cooking oil had been sharply forcing many families to cut down on spending. Before, with 5,000 naira, you can see people in the market have actually, talked about the fact that with 5,000 they can be able to have a proper meal. But all of this, it's no longer the same. That has not been what it used to be because of the current realities that individuals are facing. A couple of key concerns have been highlighted as the drivers of inflation in Nigeria, which one has been stated to be the fuel subsidy removal. You all remember when President Bola Ahmed Tinubu assumed office, he says fuel subsidy, it's gone, and he said the proceeds that would be saved from fuel subsidy would be going into compressed natural gas, and Nigeria tilting towards renewable energy, which is something that is yet to happen. And they incident going on within the Strait of Hormuz also is capitalizing on the cost of transportation. So Nigerian majorly number one key driver, as survey says, is one, the removal of a fuel subsidy, which is something that is very, very particular. And again, the second key driver, as individuals also highlighted during survey, they tagged it around foreign exchange instability, which is something, again, because Nigeria runs a dollarized economy. So the exchange rate, the fluctuation is something that is also affecting. But I'll be getting an economist who would help us, have a conversation around this, who will tell us the nitty-gritties and other angles where Nigeria can be able to, have a stable economy while the president's ambition of having a 1 trillion naira economy would still be on the way, and if we could survive all of those based on a lot of factors will be looked into, the tax reform bill and all of that. So all of those things will be looked into. So we'll see how all of this pans out. I'll be introducing my guest, who is an economist, who will be joining us virtually immediately after this break. Stay with us. Many thanks for staying with us. If you're just joining, this is Discuss, and I am Samuel Odi. Now, to help us unpack and understand the implications and the depth of this conversation we are set to happen, is an economist in the person of Bello Mohammed. Bello Mohammed is an economist and is joining us from Scotland. Bello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on today's edition of Discuss.
Yeah, good afternoon, Samuel. Thank you for having me.
Or should I say Happy New Year? I've not seen you this year at all. It's good to see you, my friend.
It has been a while. Yeah.
Get right into it. We had a conversation earlier, I think about a year ago, when the conversations about rebasing Nigerian economy was on the way. We had a few conversations, and you said it can be good. It will be good for Nigerian economy. It will help us have a stable economy. At the time we had the conversation. So looking back to the rebasing that happened and what we are currently facing, give us your assessment of what if there are successes, and if you think the Nigerian economy is doing better than what it was doing before the rebasing happened to 2010.
Yeah, so I can still recall part of our discussion, a year ago, when the rebasing discussion was ongoing, and when everywhere was on heat, people are discussing as to whether the rebase is important and what it means to our economy. So, but then if you look at the current trajectory of the economy, you would see that there are some meaningful gain. So basically, the rebase is all about changing the measurement of the inflation, because we are now basing it against 2024 compared to 2015 as it was before. So, and I think recently the NBS have released the inflation figures, and I was taking a look at the inflation figures, and yeah, we are going to say we've seen some kind of downward trend in the inflation, because it has fallen 14-month low at 15.69% recently in the April statistics, which is almost 27% down. That's dropped from a year ago. So you could see that the rebasement has really reflected in the inflation metrics. So, but then the news is that is inflation still rising, or has inflation declined? That's what should be our point of discussion right now, right? And if you look at the statistics, you still see that, oh, inflation is still rising, but then the way it is rising is much more slower compared to how it was rising before. And if you look at the month-on-month growth, you see that it has rising slightly compared to what was recorded in March. So overall, I think there is a little bit progress and signaling as to the well-being of the economy.
Around Nigerian markets and talking to commuters, and also talking to farmers and business individuals on what they think the key drivers of Nigerian inflation has been. Some highlighted the cost of production, some highlighted insecurity, some highlighted the removal of fuel subsidy, and based on the fact that we run a dollarized economy here in Nigeria, some says the instability within the foreign exchange. So you're an economist, you have more vast knowledge within this angle. What would you say are the key drivers? Are you agreeing with the people who highlighted this key fuel subsidy removal, cost of production, and energy cost as the major drivers? Do you agree with them on those basis as an economist?
Yeah, to some extent, I do agree with them. That these are the basic drivers of the inflation, and this is almost the same case if you look at the NBS report, because food and non-alcoholic beverages are the most driving component of the headline inflation. I think the recent contribution of food and headline beverages was almost 6.40%, and then we have transport as almost 1.70%, and some other component also contributing. So these are the factors that are contributing. But then if you look at the cost of food inflation, why is it contributing the most to the headline inflation? To now bring us back to the issue of breakdown in the supply chain of food and agriculture, which all boils down to the issue of insecurity, the issue of fuel subsidy, removal of the fuel subsidy, which basically transmission into transportation costs and other costs that household incur, right? So these are some of the structural factors that are really contributing to the rise in the inflation, especially issue of this insecurity. So I was looking at the NBS report recently, and I saw a very wide gap in the food inflation report. What was witnessed in urban area, for instance, in urban area, we have an inflation percent year on year of about 15.40%, and rural area of 16%, which is to say, the rural households, those living in the rural area, are exposed to this inflation more. And this is because food prices are more volatile there, and they have fewer financial cushions to smoothing these kind of inflation issues. And then if you look at it at a state level, I was looking at it and I saw that food inflation at Sokoto was almost about 25.74% year on year, and then if you look at Edo State, the headline inflation was at 5.9%, which is a very wide gap of almost 20%. So it's now get me asking this question: why is it that we have two states in the same country, but then the inflation gap is still as wide as almost 20%? So the answer here is that if you look at Sokoto basically before it used to be one of the states that produce the most of agricultural produce in the north, but then due to the issues of insecurity, the banditry, the kidnapping, which has disrupted farming activities and all, and that's why there is this shortage in production, and there is this shortage in supply of the agricultural produce, which basically explains why there is this gap. So you cannot really remove the fact that these factors are the ones really driving food inflation and overall the headline inflation, because the contribution of food and beverages to the headline inflation is almost as 6%. It is the largest contributor as of last month.
That that is for food inflation, and we're saying man cannot live without bread, they say. And so looking at those angles now, how can we find a level of sustaining or managing the rate at which food inflation is rising?
Yeah, so the thing is that there is no, one fit solution to some of this problem, but where we really need to do a lot of work is in the, area of security. We have to ensure that security, there is relatively peace and, security in some of this area that produces some of the most, that produce some of this agricultural produce, such that there are no shortages in the supply, there are no shortages in the, production processes and all. So the government have to really, you know, up up have to really do well in the area of insecurity. They are doing well, but then there is still much that needs to be done. There are a lot of work that need to be done. Farmers have to have this confidence of returning to their farms without the fear of being kidnapped, without the fear of being ambushed by by bandits or other kidnappers. As a farmer, if you have this feeling that you are going to be kidnapped or you are going to be ambushed, you are not really going to go to the farm to engage in any farming activities, and that has a direct consequences on what is being produced, what is being consumed, and the overall economic trajectory of the country. So this is where I would say the government really need to do well more.
And they are going to do well in those angles, as we all know that here in Nigeria there have been a series of insecurities in rural communities, and the Senate President told us that that will be sorted out after election. We hope it doesn't drag that. It doesn't drag that long. We cannot overemphasize how the impact of fuel subsidy removal have impacted Nigerian economy. We've seen it here in Nigeria, the high cost of transportation, and that is also one of the measures that is, increasing, making the cost of food items go up in the market. Despite the fact that it's raining season here, people are still going to farm, and there's a bit of shortage of food, and mostly before it gets to the harvest period where we get to have a lot of food in the market, we get to see downtime on the cost of food items, while all of those are still being looked into and being monitored. So let's talk energy and how SMEs are looking to survive under this kind of harsh economy. And again, given the fact that we run a dollarized economy, how do you think we can be able to navigate, and those running small scale businesses would be able to manage situations in terms like this?
Yeah, so it's really a very tough time for SMEs right now in Nigeria. The environment is really heated, and there is a lot of pressure from within and from outside, in the sense that inflation is biting hard, and then the cost of borrowing. Most of these SMEs survive on borrowing, and the cost of borrowing is also high, because if you look at the last MPR, the MPC committee meeting by the CBN, the monetary policy rate was retained at almost, I think, 26.5%. There was no change, from the February's cut. So what this means for SMEs is that they are borrowing at a very high cost, at almost 30%. So if you look at the cost of borrowing, and then if you factor in the cost of fuel, other, high cost of rent, other factors as, rising prices of other things that they put into production processes, increase in salaries of workers, and even rent. You see that if you put all these factors together, you see that it's becoming increasingly difficult for these SMEs to really survive and thrive in economy like ours. And these SMEs are really some of the backbone of the economy. They employ people, they provide employment, they contribute to the economy, they contribute to the GDP, but the environment is still not conducive for them. If you are discussing with, owners of SMEs, every day they are complaining that it is not some are even saying, going to the extent of saying it is not worthwhile, running the businesses, because most of them are running at loss. You borrow at a very high cost, and then due to the unstable environment, inflation, and some other factors, you will not be able to meet up with most of those borrowing, or at best, you end up, not profiting from the businesses. So there is really a lot that government need to do here for the SMEs. They have to kind of provide support for these SMEs for them to be able to thrive and contribute to the economy.
Cultural production and produce in Nigeria, you recommended that the government take care of the security challenges. But aside that, the cost of buying materials for all of this, do you think the Bank of Agriculture and the Bank of Industry can roll out an initiative that can get to the real farmers, so as they can continue with their farming activities after or when the government must provided a secured environment for them to go back to their farms? Because from all of these concerns, and why Nigeria is suffering the shortage of food now, is because of the insecurity going on, and we have lots of IDPs, internally displaced person, who ran away from their communities so as to, seek safety. So what role do you think the Bank of Agriculture, the Bank of Industries can play in integrating these people back into the economy and into the system, so as we can also have them do what they do and provide for themselves and also feed the nation?
Yeah, so Samuel, if you look at it, the Bank of Industry and the Bank of Agriculture always have a role to play. So when we are discussing agriculture, I would always like to make reference to the previous administration. We've seen how much they have done, with the Anchor Borrowers program. So there is a lot that these two institutions can really do for the economy, and by extension, the agricultural sectors and the farmers. So what the problem we have majorly as regards to some of these policies is that when these policies are being implemented, they do not really, most of the time, reach the farmers that need this, support the most. So, for instance, you see that the policy is being implemented and it end up, being not being pursued further, or the outcomes are not really well defined. For instance, if you are looking at supporting farmers, you have to trace the farmers to their grassroots. You have to look at, okay, who are producing the most and who are those people that needed the support the most. And then you bring these people on board and say, okay, look, you guys, we know you guys are suffering, and with all that is happening with the economy, we are looking at supporting you guys so that you can be at your best, because you being at your best is the economy being at its best. So through such kind of initiative, they will now give them all the necessary support they need. Most of these farmers doesn't need much than fertilizer and other agricultural inputs that will really improve their yield. So I think these key institutions have a major role to play. So it all boils down to how we pursue these policies and what we make our priorities and what the objectives of these policies that are being implemented are.
Right. We'll go on a quick break, and then when we return back, we'll continue this conversation as we'll look at other factors. We'll talk about Nigerian schools and the cost of, school fees, and how everything is tied together to each household. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes, many thanks for staying with us. If you're just joining, this is Discuss here on Global Television. We're looking at the state of the economy, the key drivers of Nigerians' inflation, despite the rebasing that we saw about a year ago. And though people, Nigerians, have actually highlighted what they think that is the cost of and the major drivers of Nigerian inflation. And again, an economist who I'm having a conversation with, Bello Mohammed, who joins from Scotland, also reaffirms to the fact that yes, those can be the major drivers of economy, which is fuel subsidy removal, exchange rate instability, cost of energy, and again, cost of transportation. These are the major key drivers, as I mentioned. Also, not forgetting about food and beverages, non-alcohol and alcoholic beverages as well. We haven't even looked at the hospitality sector and an agricultural sector. There are other factors within those sectors which also drive economy. But there's something else we're looking at now, how this is affecting schools and all. Bello, I saw you worked on a paper around the Nigerian schools, and can you marry these two together? How the cost of living and inflation in Nigeria, the state of the economy, is also affecting what is happening in Nigerian schools.
Yeah, so I mean, inflation is something that affects almost every aspect of our life. Whether education, hospitality, and think of it, anything. So, my recent discussion and paper article focus much more on the policies that have been embarked by the Ministry of Education and the JAM, over the past few years, which has to do with the lowering the continuous lowering of the UTME cutoff marks, the removal of mathematics, credit requirements, and the exemptions of some candidates seeking admission into education and non-agricultural program, which I found to be very troubling, because if you look at the trajectory in which our education system is going, sometimes it worries me a lot that we are going down this trajectory, and this can be really intertwined. If you look at the how this affects inflation, or how inflation affects the education sector, you'd say that because basically household pay education, even though it is cheap in Nigeria, households find it very difficult, having access to quality education. So when we are speaking about education, most of the times we just focus narrowly on the word education, so, but without focusing much more on the most important aspect of the education, which is quality education. The access that is being provided by the government across, the cheaper access that is being provided across, all the states and the country can be, termed as what I call cheap access. Having access to education does not really matter if the access is hollow, or if the access to the education you are having is not qualitative. And if you look at it, you bear me witness, and many other Nigerians can testify to the fact that our public education system is something else. Everybody is now willing to take their children or what to public educations, or government schools, or public institutions, basically because the institutions do not provide quality education. So, and as such, many have now resorted to private institutions, which is greatly costly. Today, if you go to private institutions, and if you heard of how much you'll be required to pay off as school fees, it is quite a lot. And if you compare this with how much an average in Nigeria is earning, you'll see that there is a lot of you know there is a lot of gaps in how much we are earning and how much is required of an average Nigeria to pay in terms of either school fees, or tuition fees for universities. So that's why providing access is very important, and not just access, quality access. So what the Ministry of Education and JAMP has pursued over the last decade is that they are trying to frame this access such that they want many people to be in institutions, in education, in universities, colleges of education. But then the quality of education that are being provided in some of these institutions are of very low quality. Recently, I've seen an interview where the Minister of Education is remarking that because most of these courses are not providing employment opportunities upon graduation. So they are looking at, scrapping all the courses, which in fact is not the problem. It is not that these courses are not really providing the skills, the knowledge that is required in the labor market. It is the fact is that majority of the graduates that are, push into the system are not really prepared for the education. And I say their push into the system is that because what the ministries and JAMB are always focusing is that the numbers, how many people are being admitted into the university. They don't look at the outcomes. Okay, how many people have graduated from these universities, from colleges of education, and how many people were able to contribute something meaningful to the society. So what they normally do is that they lower the entry requirement into these institutions so that almost everybody can just do the bare minimum and they will end up at public institutions, and at the end they graduate without knowing anything or having any relevant skills or knowledge to contribute to the economy. So which I see as a kind of decline in standard in the quality of education that is being provided. And we cannot really continue going through that way. And that was basically my argument in the article, that we have to rethink our approach, and we have to really rethink what we mean by access. We cannot continue providing high-low access in the name of access. We have to really provide Nigerian youth with quality education such that by the time a graduate is graduating or a candidate is graduating from a university or college of education, they'll be able to make meaningful contribution to the society.
Meaningful contribution is actually very key for any state and for the development of the state. And education is key, like they've always said. The education and the young ones are the key, and they are the future of a nation. But since this era and the future of our nation is suffering, and the Nigerian school system is also going through its own hurdles, what then does this mean for those people, those families who can't afford 3 square meal, sometimes even two? What happened to this common Nigerian family who can afford to send their children to private schools and travel them abroad to go school? What then is their hope for a country like Nigeria that lives under a democratic system? What hope do they have now? What can keep them going in terms of protecting and providing for their families? Will they be merged out as those that are not qualified to be in the elite? So how can this narrative, what can the government do to always have those in the rural communities who are the main voters and the main people that get to elect people into power? What can they do differently so as these individuals that are in their communities would feel involved, would feel love from the government in terms of providing access to good education for their young ones?
Yeah, so this will bring me back to what I've mentioned earlier briefly, the terms of access. So what the government is really trying to do now is to ensure that almost everybody have access to this education. But then the question is, what sort of education are they having access to? So in order for them to, make the voters, the community, and everybody that votes them to feel, yeah, so we are expanding access, we are providing education access to your kids, to your children, so they lower the entry point, which was the case I was arguing earlier that was not what is supposed to be done. So for instance, if you look at it, JAMB has repeatedly lowered the entry point into the university. I think as of 2017, it was around 180, which was just about 45% of the total mark. And recently it has dropped to 120 and to 150 most recently. All this is being done to accommodate people, to have people enroll into the institution. Because if you go back to the rural areas, if you go back to their schools, you see that the education outcomes, a lot of candidates, barely have enough scores that will really that will really qualify them to be enrolled into university. And that's because the education that they are being given at secondary level is not of great quality. So if you go to the public schools in the rural areas, even in the urban areas, you see that a lot of the schools, a lot of the students, are sitting in a very, a very dilapidated, classrooms without teachers. Sometimes, they go days without attending classes, and these have a kind of implication on their education outcome. At the end, what normally happens is that they will graduate without having covered what is expected of them, of the curriculum. And when they sit for these exams, they end up failing. And in order to accommodate those that fail into the university, the German Ministry of Education will now lower the entry requirement into those universities, such that those that failed will still have access to the education. And one thing to also remind you is that even the universities are also struggling. They are not being well funded. The classrooms are overstretched. You have hundreds of students in classes that are just meant for 50 people. You have to some extent thousands of students in some courses in lecture rooms that are meant for 100 or 200 people. So you see, the issue still boils down to what is our priority and what are we pursuing as an education policy. Are we pursuing enrollment rates so that every day we'll just be bragging about how many millions of graduates are going into the university and how many millions are graduating without knowing anything? Or are we going to redefine our education policy outcome to mean that, okay, we are looking at how many candidates are going into university and how many are graduating and are contributing something meaningful to the society? If you look at the complaint majorly today in Nigeria is that there is a lot of unemployment. And unemployment in the sense that we have a lot of graduates that are not able to find jobs. And if you converse with these graduates, you hear from them that they are frustrated, they have graduated over years, without jobs. They have degrees, they have, diplomas, to mention, and all sort of qualification, right? So, but then recently in an interview, the CEO of MoneyPoint was remarking that despite the company commitment to, hiring locally, they were not able to fill up the gaps of almost 500 vacant employment. So what does this mean? Basically, what the company is saying, and which is in fact true, is that we are not able to find qualified candidates to fill this position. And I feel this is the reflection of our education outcomes, because we have the graduate, but then they are not qualified. So this is basically what the Ministry of Education and the JAM has been pursuing, to push unqualified, candidates into the tertiary institutions, and they end up graduating without having the necessary skills and knowledge that is required to contribute to the society or to any company they are being employed. So that's why we have to redefine what is meant by qualification, and we have to redefine this hollow access that we keep, selling to graduates in the name of, access.
Needs to be done within the Nigerian economic and also educational system. But let's come back to the economy. It has been said by President Bola Tinubu that Nigeria attracted around 20 billion dollars in the first quarter of 2026 from direct foreign investments. Also, I'm sure you must have looked at the tax reform bill, and from what the president said and what the bill was saying, it says Nigerians, living below poverty line would be paying less or little or nothing on inflation, and then it's going to help improve the economy, as the president said, and then those elites, business individuals would pay more in taxes. Looking at the tax reform bill holistically, how do you think is going to shape the ambitious future of having a 1 trillion naira economy by President Bola Tinubu? Looking at his tax reform bill, do you think with that tax reform bill being in place, the Nigerian GDP will hit 1 trillion?
Yeah, so the tax reform bill that was passed is really kind of remarkable bill in the history of economic policies in Nigeria. But then the thing is that we cannot really tax our way to 1 trillion economy that we are targeting. And we have a large tax base in Nigeria. Of course, we have this gap of people not paying tax. We have a lot of gaps as regards to, tax remittances. But then the most important factor here is that through taxes only, we cannot really get to where we are targeting the 1 trillion economy target. So we have to focus on other areas like attracting, foreign direct investment, making the economy, business friendly, that people, SMEs can thrive, because outside taxes, we have the market. If you look at the Nigerian population, that's why it is always attractive for foreigners and for foreign investors, because there is market whatsoever you are going to, produce in Nigeria. There is the market for it. If you are producing, food, if you are producing textile, think of it. Everything that you are going to produce, there is a market for it. If you produce 10,000 today, tomorrow you'll be able to sell those 10,000 that you produce, because our population is one of our major advantage, but then we are not utilizing it to the maximum uh, maximum capacity. So we have to focus on other areas like making the economy business friendly. As I earlier mentioned, a lot of SMEs are complaining, SMEs are not thriving. We can, for us to really hit that target of the 1 trillion economy, the economy must be business friendly, such that our local businesses are able to, thrive, they are able to boom, they are able to expand, they are able to, employ our own youthful population. And through that way, we now have what we call the multiplier effect. Before you know it, we have the tax reform bill, and we now have a business friendly economy. We now have foreign direct investors trooping into the economy. So if we have the combination of these three going on simultaneously, and we have peace, relative security, such that there is this issue of insecurity, banditry, kidnapping is on the low. People are going around their businesses without the fear of being kidnapped, and stability basically. So the economy will really hit the 1 trillion target. But with taxes only, we cannot tax our way up to the $1 trillion economy. So we have to look at other factors like, making the economy business friendly, so the investor will feel attracted to invest in the economy.
You said we cannot tax our way through to a 1 trillion economy, so GDP economy. But what does this say now to the tax reform bill? Do you think, given the time that this bill is being worked on and being introduced, we talked about the CBN monetary policy rate, which they left at around 26 plus percent. But looking at it now and looking at this, all of these factors now, how feasible do you think it is that Nigeria can hit that $1 trillion economy? And if you were to give a time frame with the current realities we have on the ground, how long do you think that will take?
Well, with the current trajectory, it will really take a very long time, because as I mentioned earlier, what we are really, focusing much more now on is the tax reform bill. We've already implemented tax reform bill, and we are already, we have started to see the gains of the reform bill. But then we have to focus our attention on other things like creating a business friendly economy, attracting foreign investors,
Let me
stabilizing the
interject a bit. But why do you
economy.
think you said earlier that the economy, is stabilizing a bit, but up to now, Nigerians, it hasn't trickled down. Why do you think it hasn't trickled down yet, like to the common man in the market? Why do you think they are not yet feeling the growth and the stability that are being felt within the Nigerian National Bureau of Statistics and also in the banking sector when they are saying that the economy is recovering?
Yeah, so the thing is that one thing with the economic recovery, it doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a lot of time for the household, for people to feel the impact. For instance, we've been talking about growth, but it takes a lot of time to really materialize into the local economy. So, but then the trajectory you are currently, going through, it will say take maybe 2 to 3 quarters before people begin to feel the impact that, oh yeah, things are beginning to moderate.
2 to 3 quarters. That means we should be expecting this probably this year, or you're talking about the coming year. Well, we'll see how all of this pans out. As you know, the president promised that he understands the pain and suffering that Nigerians are going through, and is going to fade away gradually. But Nigerians are impatient; they are waiting, and they want it to really happen like yesterday, so as they can feel the impact and not just see it on the news that is things are stabilizing. So, moving on now and looking at everything, what are your advice? What recommendations would you give in terms of energy cost for SMEs who are looking to start up a business based on the current borrowing structure and the percentage rate of payment and other factors being looked together? What message would you have for one, the SMEs, and secondly, for the government of Nigeria to help make things easy for Nigerians as we're getting set to wrap up?
Well, for the SMEs, I will always say that people should start to think of alternative source of energy. Now, if you look at the current trend, people are moving towards non-renewable energy in terms of solar and other forms of non-renewable energy. So if you are setting up a business from the start, it will be much more easier for you as a business to think through that part than resulting to the common energy sources that we are having, electricity, because you don't have to deal with, electricity bills, energy costs as regards petroleum, either diesel for you to fuel your generator or to run your business. So from the onstart, you have to think of this alternative that require, even though they require huge investment at the start, but then if you are looking at long term, the benefits outweigh the cost that you are going to incur as a business if you are really starting. So my advice to businesses and SMEs will always to look at the renewable energy sources, because that's always cheaper than the non-renewable energy sources, and coupled with the high electricity bills and the inconsistency in the supply of the electricity, it is really going to be difficult if, as an SME, you are dependent on all these non-renewable energy sources. And for the government, I would say the SMEs are really trying to flourish, to expand their business, but then the environment is not really supportive. If you are borrowing at a very high cost of almost 30%, it becomes incredibly difficult for you as a business to expand. So the government have to find a ways of either supporting through grants, or that sum of support to the SME, so that they will feel supported and their businesses will be able to grow and thrive and also contribute meaningfully to the economy.
Very much, Mohammed, for Bello, for taking our time to join us on today's edition of Discuss, and thank you for all of your input on the subject matter. Arise, and we highlighted the key factors, key drivers that are actually making this arise happen. But policies are in place that are hoping, Nigerians are hoping it's the policies will actually help and cushion the effect of things in the market. And Nigerians are also calling on the government to issue around insecurity so that would go back to farm, so as Nigeria wouldn't keep would inflation at the pace or at the rate at which it is suffering it. But looking at all of these concerns, it boils down to every sector of the country, and we're hoping the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is going to help cushion the effects of all of the brands. Hopefully, that when those and policies and initiatives are being created to give relief materials to farmers, we hope it gets to actual farmers in the villages so as they can continue farming. And hopefully, we are going to see Nigeria tilting towards renewable energy as new source for power based on what is happening within the oil and gas sector and the rise of fuel price and diesel price. This is how much time will permit us to take on today's edition of Discuss. I am Samuel Odi. I'll see you again as we discuss more. Bye for now.